Biden and has made the statement, and people within the State Department that NATO is now stronger than ever before. We added what Sweden and what was the other country?
Finland, right?
Sweden and Finland to NATO, and it does expanding NATO, adding new countries to NATO. Does that make it stronger? Because when I was a kid, I'd always said like, yeah, get more and more people on. Now we got a
Yeah,
bigger team. I got more friends. I can,
yeah,
now I got my gang. I can that's
yeah,
how
yeah.
my seventh grade mind was working. But
Right.
is it true? Does expanding NATO make it stronger, adding these new members?
Um, you can make that argument because, both Sweden and Finland are prosperous countries and are at least theoretically capable of, increasing NATO's strength. Now, in the, yeah, but the thing is, NATO is supposed to be a defensive alliance. The point is to avoid war. And so it ought to be very careful about the countries that it admits to its membership. Obviously, it hasn't been. The talk about bringing in Ukraine is, of course, what started this war. And if they had brought in Ukraine, they would have really put all NATO at risk because Ukraine was in conflict with Russia and was right on the borders of Russia. Russia had made it clear that they weren't going to accept this. So if they were really focused on their core mission, which is defense and peace for Europe, they would never have considered bringing in Ukraine. And I think the same thing can be said about Finland, because Finland, historically throughout the Cold War was a neutral state, and as a neutral state, it was a buffer state. It reduced the chance of war, and now you brought them in. They have a long border with Russia. They're very hostile to Russia. You actually increase the chance of conflict. And in the end, this is not good for NATO. It really isn't. It's, maybe you have a total greater number of tanks and IFVs and so forth, but you also have a greater risk of war. And I think it seems like there is this, they're hell bent on bringing in new people, and there's this thought like more is always better, but more isn't always better. You have to stop and think, what does this person actually, or not this person, but this country, how does it change the overall situation? Does it change it for the better for us? And I would say in the case of both Finland and obviously Ukraine, that their accession to NATO does not. In the case of Ukraine, would not.
Right. Is there a way to put the brakes on this constant desire to expand NATO? Because this problem can keep on
Yeah,
occurring because we've seen what they're trying to do in Georgia, an attempted color revolution there,
right.
trying to get Georgia to attack Russia. It's just like, I wonder, they're just going to constantly go, there was, attempted color revolution in
Yeah,
Belarus
yeah.
before. It's just, what can we stop that desire to expand NATO? Or
Well,
if
theoretically,
not,
yeah, of course they could. You could decide tomorrow, but we just see no signs of that. The new leadership. We have Rutte is the new Secretary General, and then in the kind of his counterpart for the EU is this Kaja, I think, from Estonia. And if anything, they're even more gung ho than the people that they replaced. Um, So we just don't see any signs. I don't see anything coming out from the mouths of the leaders of NATO that would suggest that they are reflecting, they are considering a new, charting a new course. They are willing to pull back and admit their errors. There's no sign of it. They seem to be doubling down on everything they do. It's just like the rest of the establishment. It's just like they seem to be incapable of reflection. For them, it's all they become victims of their own ideology, instruments of their own ideology, and they can't seem to be able to step away from that and just say, okay, wait a second, maybe we got a few things wrong. It's just like, these things we know to be true and self-evident, right? Russia is evil and must be fought constantly, and NATO must expand, and we must, cut off our supplies of Russian oil and gas, and you just don't, even when occasionally maybe there's some sort of acknowledgement of the reality, like we had with um, van der Leeuwen recently, who did admit that um, that the loss of Russian gas and oil was hurting Europe. I think in the next breath, then she claimed that somehow the Russians had cut it off, which is just complete nonsense. They're just lying about it. But then it was just like, but we'll be fine. We're going to find replacements. It's so occasionally, like they start to realize, oh, well, we got a real problem here, but they cannot change their course.
It's insanity. So who's really in charge of expanding NATO? Is it there's just some kind of machine that's
Yeah,
just
well, I
like
think above all, NATO itself, part of it is just sort of like the ironclad law of all bureaucracies. Like every bureaucracy sees its main mission is to survive and to expand. That's one of the problems. Whenever you create a new agency, it's in theory, you could look at its performance over the course of a few years and decide, okay, it really hasn't done what we hoped it would. Let's abolish this agency. That never happens. You create an agency, maybe it's an utter flop. It does nothing. It makes everything worse, but it never goes away. And in fact, it just gets bigger and bigger. And that's just an ironclad law of bureaucracy, I think, just about everywhere in the world. It's certainly
so
true in the West.
so does that mean that there's this cycle where governments they have to have the governments are de facto bureaucracies and they
Yeah.
continue to expand and they create more bureaucracies and eventually they collapse under the weight of their own bureaucratic
Yeah, I
garbage.
think that's probably, I'm sure you can find exceptions to it. And maybe if you have an unusually kind of disciplined and patriotic elite in a country, you might be able to counteract that tendency. In theory you can, and I bet if you dig hard enough, you'll find examples of that. But in general, it's almost as close as you can get to a real law of history. And I
So we're at that stage where the bureaucracy's gotten so huge that it's things are beginning to crumble. So we were born
yeah,
in a bad timeline, Dad. It would have been great if we were. It's better to
yeah,
be on the upward rise,
right.
before.
Well, yeah. Well, one thing is like in the past, it's true. This was always happening. I mean, it was true. It's been true, like ever since the 50s or the end of World War II. I think there's no question about it, and it's tended to accelerate. Started to really accelerate in the 60s. But the thing is that the U.S. economy was strong and was growing, and so you could say, okay, well, you're just like sort of like think of it as fatty tissues on a body or something as it's weighing the body down. But if the body is still growing and adding muscle, the organism overall is still healthy, and that was true for at least a few decades, like 60s through the 90s and into the. But now, the, the organism is still depositing the fat, and the and the muscle is starting to atrophy, and so now we're getting a sick organism.